You mentioned that. It's true, nobody talks about it. I mean, we just had a tax cut in the 9th year of an economic expansion that adds $1.5 trillion to the national debt over 10 years. I mean, that obviously that increases the cost on the debt. Then you had in the last cycle since 2007, 14 trillion of new debt added, public and private, and all you got was about a 4.5 trillion increase in GDP. That has to be worrying, and nobody talks about it. Out of this 47 trillion debt, 20% is rolled over every year. So you can make the calculation. If interest rates go up by 1%, debt servicing costs go up by 100 billion a year, and that's about the size of the benefit of the tax cut. So go figure. I think debt will become a lot more of a topic in the next few months.
We project the world economy to grow at a pace of 3.5% in 2017, up from 3.1% last year, and at a pace of 3.6% in 2018. Acceleration will be broad-based.
Global debt has reached record highs without any signs of relief. While central bankers try to explain away the phenomenon of these out-of-control numbers, it's not much of a mystery. Immediate consumption with the promise of repayment sometime in the future has consequences. Global debt is staggering to the point most of it will never be repaid. Certainly not in our generation, perhaps by our grandchildren. But as global debt keeps mounting, the picture is doubtful.
Billions and 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 billions and
the most excited group out there are big CEOs about a tax plan. They all tell me how excited they are to get a tax plan that makes the United States competitive, makes it so they can grow their business domestically, makes it so they can actually pay wages here. We create wage inflation, which means the workers get paid more, the workers have more disposable income, the workers spend more, and we see the whole trickle down through the economy. And that's good for the economy.
If the tax reform bill goes through, do you plan to increase investment, your company's investment, capital investment? Just a show of hands, the tax reform goes through? Okay.
Why aren't the other hands up?
Why aren't the other hands up?
John,
Okay. Why aren't the other hands up?
Why aren't the other hands up?
John, 1% of Americans earned wages of about $110,000 a year. By 1990, after about 10 years of Reaganomics, boing, the top 1% had seen their wages rise by 80%. Trickle-down economics, though, right? What's good for the rich is good for all of us, right? Not quite. Here's the average wages of the rest of the country in 1980. And here's what happened for the rest of the country after about 10 years of Reaganomics. Flat. A whopping 3% rise in wages in 10 years. The richest people see their fortunes go up like the Matterhorn. Everybody else, nothing.
Damn you, Roger. Roger.
Senate bill on what they call a static score costs more than $1.5 trillion, or about $1.5 trillion, which means that's how much it increases the deficit, which in turn will increase the debt. Our debt right now is at the highest it's been since World War II. It's more than 100% of GDP. What this means is, depending on the level of growth, the Senate believes and wants to believe that this will spur such great economic growth that it will in fact reduce the deficit, but even the Joint Committee on Taxation, counting in economic growth, doesn't think that it will do that. The dynamic score that counts in economic growth says it'll be more than $1 trillion in increase in the deficit.
Following the bursting of the housing bubble, both the Bush and Obama administrations attempted to jumpstart the economy with stimulus spending. Stimulus spending is often accompanied by the phrase, "the government must create jobs." The theory is that every dollar the government spends is income for someone, who, when he spends that income, provides income for another person. This is the Keynesian multiplier effect. Critics argue that the multiplier effect overlooks the fact that the money the government spends doesn't fall from the sky. Every dollar the government spends, it must obtain, either through taxing or borrowing or printing money.
The government was spending with the right hand, putting money into the economy, but the fundraising was done through the bond market, and therefore it took the same money out of the economy with the left hand. There was no increase in total purchasing power, and that's why the government spending couldn't have an impact.
When a government increases spending,
the aggregate demand curve shifts out, which increases inflation. Now, central banks often try to stabilize prices. So if fiscal spending shifts the aggregate demand curve out, increasing inflation, the central bank might choose to contract the money supply. Contracting the money supply means shifting the aggregate demand curve inwards. In other words, monetary policy could offset or reverse the fiscal policy expansion. When a central bank responds to expansionary fiscal policy with contractionary monetary policy, we call this a monetary offset.
The phenomenon of crowding out is one of the key things to understand in accounts of public spending. Ultimately, there's only a certain amount of investment capital around. To the extent that the government is using that money, whether for investment or for current spending, it's not available to other people. So if the government sells lots and lots of bonds to private investors and uses the money it gets from selling the bonds to fund its current spending, those private investors are not investing in other kinds of economic activity, which might well be more productive than investing in government debt, given that the government activity might not be very productive. The question of whether or not government money is always going to be less productive than private spending is ultimately an empirical one. We can say that in principle we would expect this to be the case. That's because generally speaking, if you're spending your own money on yourself, you're going to do it very carefully. If you're spending somebody else's money on yourself, you're also going to be reasonably careful about it. However, if you're spending somebody else's money on somebody else, which is what is the case with governments, then you have no real incentive to use that money effectively or efficiently. And there are many, many examples from history that bear this out. There is a case for saying that there are certain kinds of spending which are more efficient when carried out by government because of the economies of scale that government possesses. However, this is almost always outweighed, and I would argue in fact always outweighed, by the huge inefficiency costs that come with the less productive public management and the fact that public provision does not face the profits and loss incentives which lead private providers to constantly look to improve the quality of their service and cut out waste and unnecessary costs.
The adversary is closer to home. It's the Pentagon bureaucracy. According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
2.3 trillion with a T.
Those numbers are pie in the sky. The books are cooked routinely year after year after year.
God damn it, Gump! You're a goddamn genius. That's the most outstanding answer I've ever heard. You must have a goddamn IQ of 160. You are goddamn gifted, Private Gump.
You would think, for sure, because the whole notion of inflation is there's too much money and not enough goods in circulation, and so you reduce the money supply. And if you start to reduce the money supply by raising rates and reducing the balance sheet, letting those bonds run off the balance sheet, which is the antithesis of quantitative easing, and there's no inflation, then you risk deflation, actually.
Businesses could also act in ways that partially offset a fiscal stimulus. For example, if the government increases spending by borrowing, this will tend to increase the interest rate in the loadable funds market. And if the interest rate increases, businesses may scale back on their investment. So remember that real GDP is consumption plus investment plus government spending and net exports. So when G increases, we may see a decrease in I, investment, offsetting the fiscal stimulus and weakening the effects of the multiplier. Consumers could also respond to fiscal policy in ways that make fiscal policy less effective. if the government cuts taxes to stimulate the economy. People might then choose to save the tax cut. Now, saving money from a tax cut actually makes a lot of sense if people expect that tax cuts today will be matched by tax increases tomorrow. However, if people save their tax cuts instead of spending them, then the aggregate demand curve never shifts out. The multiplier will be zero, and there will be no systematic macroeconomic effects.
Look at this chart. Out of every $10 in deficit reduction, $5, and actually a little more, comes from spending cuts. $4 comes from taxes on incomes of those with more than $200,000 a year in income. And just $1 comes from everyone else. This plan is fair, it's balanced, and it will work.
Feel the funk, y'all. Looking good, you handsome motherfucker.
By selling more goods to us and buying less goods from us. Remember, capital imports are the opposite of the trade deficit. If you have a trade deficit, you got capital imports, and you can't have capital imports without a trade deficit, period. It's accounting. It's not theory. It's not ideology. The trade deficit is wonderful for us. Now,
well, I was just trying to be helpful. Well, help yourself to a fucking science book, because you're talking like a fucking retard.
So why now? Is it
Because
just,
the
no, we can't do
cupboard
this?
is there. There's no more cuts to make.
They spend almost $4 trillion and the cupboard's bare? This is nuts. Central planners think without big government, planes will crash, trains, parks, and Big Bird will disappear. But none of it's true. There is so much we could cut and should cut, like NPR and PBS funding. There shouldn't be government television, and Big Bird doesn't even need the money. Foreign aid. It usually does more harm than good. On to bigger cuts. End the war on drugs. When Americans hurt only themselves, leave them alone. Kill Fannie and Freddie. Government shouldn't finance 90% of America's mortgages. That's socialism. Eliminate cabinet departments like Commerce, Energy, Agriculture, Secretary. We don't need them. Commerce happens. It doesn't need a department. Education's a local responsibility. The Fed spending $100 billion a year didn't raise test scores one bit. Finally, the three biggest programs. First, defense. We are not safer when we try to police the world. We could cut military spending by hundreds of billions if we limited the military's mission to its intended role, protecting Americans. And finally, Social Security and Medicare. We have to do things like raise the retirement age and turn Medicare into an insurance plan that's self-sustaining. That means if I want the latest and fancy medicine, I have to pay for it myself.
She is cruel. Laughs at you when you are naked. But you keep coming back for more and more. Why? Because she is the only prostitute I can afford.
What do you attribute to 3.1% GDP?
What do I don't think there is any 3.1%.
We got a 3.1% GDP 2 weeks ago.
Well, I mean, for one quarter,
and we got it the quarter before. We got it the earlier revision as well.
The average GDP growth for the last couple of years has been plus or minus 2%.
But we but we got a 3.1% GDP. I'm just saying. I mean, do you not think things are getting better? Do you not think there's fundamental strength in the backdrop for the
No, I do not. I think we're.
Of the roughly 50,000 homes in the Florida Keys, 90% are estimated to be damaged or destroyed by Hurricane Irma.
Here's a paradox. It seems obvious that disasters destroy wealth, and yet cleaning up after a disaster creates jobs, and creating jobs seems to create wealth. So do natural disasters create wealth, or do they destroy wealth?
Percent rating. How is it that we're growing at a 3% clip?
Well, I'm surprised. I want to see the details in terms of the inventory contribution versus the consumer spending, because obviously what we care about is seeing strong spending rather than just some inventory build. And I know that at least the Atlanta Fed in their forecast had built in almost a full percentage point contribution from inventories, largely due from the hurricanes that we saw. So that will be interesting to look at. But as you know, my concern has been that there's been a broad deceleration in growth. Not that the wheels are coming off, but that, we've been generally churning downward to sideways a little bit.
Tonight, along the Texas Gulf Coast, utter devastation. In the town of Rockport, entire blocks are decimated.
Contribute to 3.1% GDP.
What do I don't think there is any 3.1%.
We got a 3.1% GDP 2 weeks ago.
Whenever we use a resource for one purpose, like spending money to fix a window, we have to give up the opportunity to use that resource for any other purpose. So in order to know whether the use of a resource has created wealth or not, we have to compare it with the alternative uses we had to forego. If the use we make of the resource is more beneficial than the other ways we might have used it, then we have created wealth. But if we missed the chance to do something else more beneficial with that resource, then we have destroyed wealth. The amount
damage caused by hurricanes Irma and Harvey and the forthcoming Jose could cost Lloyd's of London insurers $200 billion. Lloyd's
would attribute to 3.1% GDP.
What do
That means that one effect is there for us to see, but the other effect is never there for us to see. And opportunity costs are always effects of that second type. Opportunity costs are hard to see for the simple reason that they are alternatives that never take place. Opportunity costs are things that never happen. That's why opportunity costs remain hidden in the shadows.
It's a nail biter.
Yeah, and trade and inventories added a combined 1.14 to the growth.
Okay. Yeah, it was supposed to add about 0.8, so that's a substantially larger add.
Yeah.
So real final sales then were 1.6.
Yeah.
So that's not, that's down from 2.9 last quarter.
Whoa.
That's a pretty big slowdown. So anyway.
Thanks so much for joining us. So first, let's talk about growth in the world today. You see all this market volatility. You see things getting better in the economy. Where is the growth in your view?
Everywhere.
Really? That's how good it is.
It's how good it is. I mean, we have a global economy that is, for the first time in really many people's professional lives, growing in a synchronized fashion.
Big guy. He's joking around. Feels so good when he jokes.
On one, you say by some of the measurements you're looking at, we are in for a global slowdown here. Right. Is that right?
Absolutely. Well,
Can you explain this chart here?
Sure, absolutely. Well, we've been saying since the fall that our forward-looking data was pointing to a global growth slowdown, a synchronized global growth slowdown after having forecast the upturn last year. Now, that's no longer a forecast, it's a fact. This chart shows GDP growth, and this is quarterly annualized GDP growth for the three largest developed economies, the U.S. at the top, you have Eurozone in the middle, and Japan at the bottom. And you see that they've already begun to roll over. GDP is looking in the rearview mirror. That's not looking ahead. It's already happening.
Negotiations are nearly done on that spending package. The final text is expected to come out now between mid to late morning, and a source gave me a rundown of what is in and what is out. It includes $1.6 billion for border security. Now, that money is focused on technology rather than a wall, though it will include 33 miles of border fencing. It also includes money for that gateway tunnel between New York and New Jersey by increasing funding for Amtrak and for some other capital accounts. There's also $2.8 billion in there for opioid funding, including treatment. There is no defunding of so-called sanctuary cities. I'm also told that leadership of both the Republicans and the Democrats will be meeting in Speaker Ryan's office at 9:45 this morning to hash out the final minor details that are remaining. Of course, we will keep you posted on all the latest, guys. Back over to you.
That approach forgets the fact that most of the expenditure, huge amounts, are a terrible idea to begin with. We don't want most of that expenditure. It's all been put there by special interest group. So even if we had a huge surplus, we should still be cutting an enormous fraction of federal expenditure. And that's the huge problem. It's the expenditure stupid should be the line, not it's the deficit stupid. Why is spending bad in and of itself? It's bad because, first of all, that spending is money that could have been in the private sector. It is spending that could have been done by a private business or an individual on something that they thought was productive or useful or valuable. So we're making decisions about that spending in Washington instead of out there in the country by individuals. But in addition, that spending is distorting all of the ways that resources are allocated. By spending money to subsidize health insurance, we're encouraging people to buy too much health care. That's really bad for the efficiency of the healthcare system. By spending money trying to enforce drug prohibition, we're creating crime and corruption. That's really bad for the economy. And the list goes on, with few exceptions, such as, say, some of national defense. Spending causes tons of problems because it interferes in the workings of private markets.
Tell them I hate them. Baloney. Trickle-down economics is a cruel joke. Just look at the evidence.
When President Reagan came into office in 1981, he inherited a $994 million national debt. By the time he left, it had ballooned to $2.6 billion. Ronald Reagan, patron saint of fiscal conservatism, supposedly, grew the national debt by an astonishing 186% during his 8 years in office, which is what tends to happen when the government drastically reduces the amount of tax revenue it collects. When the Reagan folks tried to argue that the huge deficits they were creating were not that big of a deal, they were kindly corrected by editorials like this one in the Washington Post from January 1988. Quote, "The deficit is a terrible legacy for which the country will be paying socially as well as financially for years. The only thing worse would be to believe the gloss now being put on it that would condemn another generation to repeat what the country should repent instead." So the largest income inequality since the government started tracking those things, and a skyrocketing national debt. Thank you, Reaganomics.
And this is only the beginning.
On that point, Ronald Reagan was right. Trickle-down economics is back.
And you are Gina?
Gina. Hey, what's up?
Nothing.
At that level, a 1 percentage point increase in the interest rate would cost the government an additional $147 billion a year in interest charges. That's more than the annual cost of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. In fact, comparing the government's annual interest expense to the annual cost of all the wars the U.S. has fought, we see that the interest rate on the debt costs us more than half of what World War II cost annually. At the time, World War II was the costliest effort the government had ever undertaken. 3 years ago, the government was paying a 4% interest rate. 10 years ago, it was paying a 6% interest rate. 20 years ago, it was paying an 8% interest rate. If the interest rate rises to 6% again, which historically is not only likely but virtually inevitable, the interest charges the government accrues will equal the annual cost of World War II. If interest rates rise to 8%, a level we saw only a generation ago, the amount of interest the government will pay each year will be the equivalent of waging all the wars it has ever waged combined. There are only two direct consequences of debt: the principal payments and the interest expense. Other consequences flow from these.
When the government has money to give away, people or firms will spend time and resources competing for that rent through applications, proposals, lobbying, and other means. This rent-seeking wastes resources, and it leads to contracts being awarded to the companies that are the best at lobbying for the rent, not the companies that are best at producing the service we want to contract for. Worse, much or even most of the money being given away is wasted, dissipated in the competition to win the rent in the first place. And yet, so much of our political discourse focuses on how much money should be given away and to whom, without acknowledging the problem of rent seeking. It's time for voters and politicians alike to learn that you can't just give money away.
Motorboat? You play the motorboat? You motorboating son of a bitch, you old sailor, you. Where is she? She's still in the house?
If you look at the U.S. current account deficit, which is how, or even the trade deficit, which is how the U.S. measures itself, given that the U.S. is close to full employment right now, and given that there's a fair amount of stimulus coming through the tax reform, it is likely that the U.S. is going to run a large fiscal deficit, and that's going to spread into a current account deficit and a trade deficit. They're going to spend more on goods from abroad. If that's how they measure their success, Well, things are going to get worse because they're going to see that the trade deficit is going to expand. And it's not because others are cheating, it's because the U.S. will be consuming more of foreign goods.
Professor,
Sabu! I seen all your movies, man. Boy, you bad. Riding that magic carpet board, ain't got to worry about no gas. Can I get the TV in the bathroom? I don't want to buy no hubcap. Oh. Say hello to Gaddafi for me. Oh.
But consumer sentiment is very strong even now, despite
but
all
sentiment and actually doing are two different things, you know.
Possibly, but it's not just consumption which is picking up. Investment has also been picking up. And investment spending goes in capital goods, a lot of which are manufactured elsewhere. So given that total demand could well go up as a result of the stimulus, and given production capacity is limited because of the fairly full employed labor market, that means it's going to spread into foreign goods. So there will be a change in the trade deficit, and it will go in the opposite direction to what the administration currently wants, and it'll have to explain it away.
The highest that it's been in history, in recent times at least, is about 20.6% of GDP. If we don't do anything, it's going to go up to 40% plus of GDP by 2040 if we all of a sudden just continue to do what we're doing now and then want to try to balance the budget in 2040. If we don't extend the Bush tax cuts, in other words, if they all expire, taxes will be 24% of GDP within the next 10 years or so and moving up. My view is that you can solve the problem for less than 24% of GDP. That everything has to be on the table, that the problem is primarily a spending problem, but that you're going to have more revenues because there's a new four-letter word that people have to deal with. It's called math. The math doesn't come close to working. You can't grow your way out. You can't tax your way out. You can't just cut your way out. You can't inflate your way out. You've got to do a number of things. We want to keep taxes as low as we can, but here's the key. The sooner we act, the lower they can be. So the miracle of compounding will work for us. As Albert Einstein said, the most powerful force on earth is not nuclear energy, it's the power of compounding. And when you're a saver, it works for you. When you're a debtor, it works against you. It also means that when you act sooner rather than later, the less draconian the changes have to be, the less the burdens have to be, the more transition time, the better ability to plan. So let's act sooner rather than later. Taxes are going up on a lot more people than those making $250,000 or more. Why? Math.
You're crazy. You're crazy, man. You're crazy. I like you, but you're crazy.
Think the failure of government is all around us. I guess we can't get too excited and we better not get complacent, but it's great news. But of course, these are views that many of us, including you, probably have shared for a long time. But I think, maybe Obamacare is such a transparent failure of big government, and foreign policy is such a failure and intrusion of our liberties. NSA and all this spying, it's all around us, and it's a failure. And I think it's really great news that people are starting to recognize this, because I don't think we can get the replacement there until people give up what we have. The Soviet system collapsed on its own weight because it was a failed system. But I believe this intrusion on our civil liberties, the foreign policy, and the Keynesian economics is totally failed. And people are starting to recognize it. So the job now we have is to replace it with something. What do we offer? And that's why I'm delighted that you're on a program now offering some of the ideas that can replace all this government intrusion where government's going to be taking care of us all the time and making us safe. So we have to, it's a whole new paradigm. I mean, we have to look at this differently. But this is where I'm encouraged, because so many young people are looking very carefully at this philosophy of liberty.